Welcome back to the afternoon session. Comrades, I think you've been living on Mars not to realise that there's been massive upheavals in the Middle East and States recently. And we're very fortunate today to have Bob Labi here to talk to us. When I asked Alex how long Bob had been working in the International, all I got was forever. So it's a very long time. So hopefully Bob's going to talk to us today about the events that have been occurring and describe and analyse each other.
Right, thanks. Well, comrades, in one sense, this is a bit of a difficult lead-off to give because news is developing all the time. Those of you who are checking your smartphones, maybe it will update me as it goes along. But partly because of that, I don't intend to go into a sort of review of exactly everything that's happened in the last few weeks. Because I think it's more important at a meeting like this to already to draw some conclusions from what has happened in the last few weeks, see what lessons to learn and what it means for the future development. And I'll say this because obviously what has happened first of all in Tunisia and then now currently in Egypt has shaken not just the Middle East but also set an example around the world. There is no doubt that the movement in Egypt especially has inspired millions upon millions of people. Particularly, if you like, in Western Europe, there's a sort of, it's partly true, but there's also a bit of a racist attitude towards the Arab states. Well, what do you expect? All the Arab states are rotten, they're corrupt, they've just got venal leaders, etc., 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 all of which has got some truth in it. There's an element of truth, even though it's presented sometimes in a bit of a racist way against all Arabs. But therefore, this moment has seen this immense mass movement against these rotten regimes, against these rotten and corrupt rulers, has inspired an enormous amount of sympathy for this movement. It's also struck fear into many rulers around the world. Some comrades may know that in China in the last few weeks, the Chinese authorities have blocked any internet searches in the Chinese language which uses the word Egypt. It's been totally blocked. Not as they're using English, but if you use the Chinese for Egypt, you can't use any internet search engines because they're obviously terrified of what this movement could actually mean. And it comes back to a point that we made over 3 years ago when the world crisis began to develop in 2007, that we were entering into a period of revolution and counter-revolution, that the whole world had become far more unstable. And we've seen, as Alex pointed out this morning, the movements which took place in the different countries of Europe in the last year. But here we have seen in the Middle East, and especially in Egypt, a revolution begin, which is combined, brings together a number of different factors. Obviously, the enormous hostility to the regime, a rotten and corrupt regime. You know, with all this talk sometimes of people, commentators saying what role Mubarak has played, we should remember that one of the things that Mubarak has done in his 30 years in office is to enrich himself. The lowest estimate of his family's fortune is $40 billion US. And certainly he didn't amass that in his career as an Air Force pilot in the Egyptian Air Force. At the same time, it's not just, the movement hasn't just been inspired by the hostility to the rotten, corrupt dictatorship, but also the impact of the economic crisis. The enormous increase in prices, in food and fuel prices, something which obviously is an international phenomenon at the same time. The mounting unemployment in Egypt as well. The fact that it seemed that society wasn't going anywhere. And then, of course, there was the example of what happened in Tunisia, where in a matter of weeks, the dictator of Tunisia, Ben Ali, was forced out of office. And therefore, we're seeing, if you like, really revolts in one sense, not just of the working class, but in countries like Tunisia and Egypt, of almost the entire nation actually rising up against these regimes. Something which, as I've just said, is having and will have in the future a very wide international impact. But at the same time, the events of the last few days, when it appears that there's been some kind of stalemate in the situation, when it's not clear what's actually going to happen, but also, if you like, naturally gives rise to the discussion of what is happening to the revolution. And it's precisely this aspect which we ourselves have got to learn from, have got to study and learn from, because in one sense what we've already seen in Egypt is something which is not unique just to Egypt, but it's something which we've seen in other movements in the past, in other revolutions in the past, and we'll see in the future. And therefore, when we analyse, when we look at a movement like that which is taking place in Egypt, it's not just a question of being inspired by the movement. It's not just a question of where necessary, organising solidarity, but also to see what lessons can be learned on it, what lessons can be applied, both, if you like, to secure the victory of that revolution, but also for struggles in other countries as well. And certainly what we've seen in Egypt is the immense power and the strength of the mass movement, of how society can be completely shaken by these movements, and how the participants can be energized, can be activized. Now, we don't know full details about what has been happening in Egypt. The reports have by and large, for instance, been limited to what's happened in Cairo and in Alexandria. We have very limited knowledge, for instance, of what happened in the important city of Suez, where it seems that, at least at the height of the fighting, the state machine collapsed in Suez, and if you like, the forces of the state actually fled the city. Whether that's completely accurate or not, we don't know. We don't know what actually happened in that important city, who took over, if anybody. Also, it's not clear what has been the role of the working class in an organized sense in Egypt in the recent period. The official trade unions are controlled by the state, but we did see in strikes which developed 2 or 3 years ago, the beginnings of the development of independent trade unions, where you have significant strikes, for instance, in factories around Alexandria, I think in 2008. But it's not clear at this moment, we don't have the information as to what role different sections of the working class actually played in this movement. Now, what is absolutely clear is it stopped the entire country for a time. That it if you like, obviously enormously isolated the regime, but also, despite the success of this mass movement, we also saw the limits of just this type of spontaneous action on itself, and the very success of the movement posed the question of what should be the next step. And because in the movement and how it developed in Egypt, there was no force which could actually say, this is the next step which we should do. Instead of just, if you like, occupying some of the main squares and holding demonstrations, we need to take offensive actions against the regime, offensive actions to overthrow the regime, to try and split the armed forces, because there was no direction, if you like, being given. We had this sort of stalemate begin to develop, which is, if you like, first of all, it gave the encouragement to the Mubarak regime to attempt to strike back. That was the meaning of the attacks which took place in central Cairo a few days ago. Those attacks were defeated. If you like, the attacks by the secret police and elements of pro-Mubarak supporters, those attacks were defeated. But nevertheless, despite the defeats of those attacks, there was still an element of a stalemate in Egypt at that time. And this allowed other elements, if you like, both around the US government, other elements among the ruling class and imperialism, to develop their own strategy to try and contain the movement. Now already, at the time of the rigged elections in November, December last year, there were pro-capitalist commentators outside Egypt saying that this regime could no longer continue. Comrades may remember that in the elections which were so-called elections which took place in November, December last year in Egypt, there was absolutely enormous rigging, but also the participation was less than 10% of the population even bothered to try and vote. And pro-capitalist commentators drew the conclusion that this regime couldn't last much longer. That given such enormous opposition, or potential opposition, should we say, towards the regime, there had to be a way to try and find a way, if you like, from their point of view, of managing what was actually happening. Now, we ourselves identified the crisis which was unfolding in Egypt at the time. If the comrades look, for instance, at the World Relations document which we produced for our World Congress, which was held in December of last year, there's actually a special section on Egypt, on the crisis which is developing. And actually, sometimes we make broad predictions, sometimes we make specific predictions. They're not always right, specific ones. But actually, in the World Perspectives document, there is a specific prediction about Egypt, which may prove to be exactly right, in that we highlighted the role of the intelligence chief, the person who is now the vice president of Egypt, that he may be picked by imperialism to play an important role to try and, if you like, maintain order in a post-Mubarak period. Whether or not that actually happened to that individual, that's a different question. But we ourselves also saw what was developing in Egypt and how the movement was being prepared there. Now, in this situation, what we're seeing at the present time is an attempt by elements in the Egyptian state and also imperialism to control the movement. The comrade Ken just showed me on his the latest news flash that they've established a committee, apparently, involving some of the opposition and the government to discuss what is going to happen next. And it's clear what they want is the so-called managed transition. And what they mean by that is a number of different things. Obviously, on the one hand, there are elements in the state machine who are maybe not so directly linked to Mubarak, but don't want to be swept away by the storm of revolution and want to maintain their positions inside the state machine. They want to find a way of somehow negotiating, managing their own positions in the state machine, and by that means their possibilities to loot from the society as a whole. From the more broader aspect of the interest of capitalism as a whole, from the interest of imperialism, what they want to do is to try and find a way to control the movement, to ensure that the movement doesn't develop further and to actually become a threat to either capitalism itself or to become a too disruptive force in the Middle East. And therefore now we're going to inevitably have the talk about the need for all Egyptians to come together, to renovate society, that everyone should cooperate, with the pressure to have some kind of perhaps government of national unity, have some kind of provisional government which will organize elections in an attempt to stabilize the situation, in the interest of capitalism. And we saw this process, if you like, also take place in Tunisia. Because what happened in Tunisia is that as the mass movement developed there, the military in Tunisia realized they couldn't suppress the movement. The president asked the military to be prepared to open fire on the protesters in Tunisia. The military were not prepared to do it because they realized that A, that wouldn't succeed in crushing the movement, B, it could lead to even a worse crisis from their point of view, an explosion which could sweep away most of the old order. So in that situation, the military commander said to the president, no, we're not going to fire, your time is up, and he put him and his family on a plane and they left the country. It was an attempt by the military in Tunisia to control the situation, and therefore in Tunisia at the present time, we've got a very unstable position where the old state machine, minus the old president, still remains in power, attempting to control the situation. Interestingly, obviously, significant sections of workers and youth in Tunisia feel frustrated and feel angry. They see that a big section of the old elite are continuing in office. They feel that their own demands are not being met. And this is giving, after, if you like, a brief pause, this is giving rise, if you like, to new tensions in Tunisia. There were even reports in Tunisia of a clash in one Tunisian city yesterday where there was demonstration outside a the local police headquarters,
whether